At 11:42 p.m., my mother sent me the emergency code we hadn't used since I was 13. 3 words, no explanation. Then a location pin from her kitchen in Raleigh. 10 minutes later, I was standing in the rain behind her house, with the spare key digging into my palm so hard it left marks. I remember thinking how strange it was that the porch light was still on. My mother never left lights on late at night. Elaine Mercer believed in turning off lamps, sealing leftovers and reused butter tubs, and keeping the thermostat low enough to build character. That porch light glowing through the rain felt wrong before I even stepped inside. I stayed still for a second and listened. Thunder somewhere off toward the interstate. Water dripping from the gutters. A television playing faintly inside the house. No yelling, no crashing. That scared me more. I unlocked the back door carefully and stepped into the kitchen. The smell hit first. Burnt coffee and whiskey. Then I saw the broken mug near the sink. I didn't call out right away. Old habits die hard. 26 years in Army intelligence teaches you to walk into a room quietly and notice details before emotions get involved. One chair pushed back too far from the table, cabinet door hanging open. My mother's purse on the floor and a smear of lipstick on a paper towel beside the sink, not fresh, recently wiped. I heard Dennis before I saw him. Ella, he barked from the living room. Who's in the kitchen? Still drunk enough to sound mean. I stepped around the corner slowly. Dennis Hellbrook was sitting in his recliner with a glass of bourbon balanced on his stomach and a Braves game muted on television. He looked exactly like every aging bully in every North Carolina suburb I'd ever driven through. Gray hair combed too carefully. Expensive watch he couldn't afford anymore. Polo shirt stretched tight over a retirement belly. His eyes narrowed when he saw me. "Well," he said. "Look who decided to visit." I ignored him and looked at my mother. Elaine stood near the hallway, with one hand clutching her cardigan closed. Even from across the room, I could see the split along her lower lip beneath faded pink lipstick. Something inside me went cold. Not hot. Cold. That's the part civilians never understand about people who've spent years in high-pressure work. Real anger doesn't always explode first. Sometimes it freezes solid. "Mom," I said quietly, "you okay?" Dennis answered for her. She dropped a damn mug and cut herself cleaning it up. My mother tried to smile, and that almost hurt worse than the cut. "I'm all right, honey." No, she wasn't. I knew her tells, the tight shoulders, the way she avoided eye contact when she was trying to calm somebody down. I'd seen it when I was a kid after my father died, and bill collectors used to call the house. Dennis sat forward in the recliner. You can't just walk into people's homes in the middle of the night. I looked at him for the first time. My mother sent me an emergency code. His face changed for maybe half a second. Then he laughed. "Jesus Christ, you make everything dramatic." I kept my voice even. "Mom, do you want me here?" Dennis immediately cut in again. "She's tired. You should go home." But my mother nodded. Small movement, barely visible, still enough. Dennis stood up too fast. Bourbon sloshing onto the carpet. "For God's sake, Elaine, tell her to stop acting like she's in one of those damn military movies." There it was, the military comment. Dennis loved those. For 12 years, he'd treated my Army career like a hobby I lucked into. According to him, women in the military either pushed paperwork or posed for recruitment commercials. I never corrected him. Honestly, after a certain age, you stopped trying to convince insecure men of anything. Most people back home thought I'd worked some boring federal desk job near Fort Liberty. That was fine with me. Easier snorts than explaining classified assignments to strangers at church potlucks. Dennis took a step closer. "You got your little drama fixed now." The whiskey rolling off him made my eyes sting. I glanced at my mother again. Her cardigan sleeve had slipped slightly, bruising, not fresh. That told me everything I needed to know. My chest tightened so suddenly I had to unclench my jaw before speaking. "How long?" I asked her softly. Dennis scoffed. "Oh, for Christ's sake." My mother looked down at the carpet, and that silence said more than any confession ever could. Dennis pointed toward the door. "You need to leave." I still remember how calm my voice sounded, number that irritated him more than yelling would have. Men like Dennis feed off emotional reactions. Calmness makes them nervous. He moved toward me fast enough that my body reacted before my brain finished deciding. His hand grabbed my wrist. Wrong decision. I turned, slightly, rotated his arm inward, and pinned him against the refrigerator in less than 2 seconds. Not hard enough to injure him, just enough to stop him. The bourbon glass shattered somewhere behind us. Dennis let out a startled grunt. "What the hell? Don't touch me again," I said quietly. I released him immediately and stepped back. My mother stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. Dennis rubbed his shoulder, stunned less by the pain than the humiliation. "You crazy bitch," he muttered. I ignored him. "Mom," I said, "get your overnight bag." Dennis barked out a laugh. "She's not going anywhere." But this time, my mother didn't answer him. She disappeared down the hallway silently. That scared him. You could actually see the moment he realized control was slipping. "Elaine," he snapped, "don't start this nonsense." I picked up her purse from the floor and set it on the table. Dennis looked at me carefully now. "Really?" Looked at me. Probably for the first time in years. "You think you can come in here and scare me?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, Dennis. If I wanted to scare you, you'd already know." The room went quiet except for rain hitting the windows. A few minutes later, my mother came back carrying an old blue overnight bag I recognized from childhood vacations to Myrtle Beach. Dennis looked genuinely confused, like he couldn't believe she was actually leaving. That's the thing about men like him. They mistake endurance for loyalty. My mother stopped beside me near the door, still trembling slightly. I took the bag from her gently. Then Dennis said the sentence that changed everything. "She'll come back tomorrow. She always does." My mother looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time all night, she spoke clearly. "No," she said softly. "I don't think I will. We did not drive away that night." That was the first thing people always ask when I tell this story. "Why didn't you just take your mother and leave?" I wanted to. Believe me. I had her overnight bag in my hand, Dennis standing there red-faced and shaking, and every instinct in my body told me to get her into my truck and put 20M between us and that house. But my mother stopped in the doorway. Her slippers were soaked from the rain blowing across the back porch. One hand held the frame like she needed it to stay upright. "Rachel," she whispered, "I can't just leave." Dennis heard that and smiled a little. Not much. Just enough. That tiny smile told me he had been counting on shame for a long time. I looked at her and softened my voice. "Mom, you can?" She shook her head. "The house, the bills, my medication, the insurance. He'll say I'm confused." Dennis folded his arms. "Because you are confused, Elaine." I turned toward him. "Stop talking." He opened his mouth anyway, then seemed to remember the refrigerator incident and shut it again. My mother looked so small standing there. That was what got me. She had always been 5'6", sturdy, practical. The kind of woman who could carry groceries in one hand and a church casserole in the other. But that night, she looked like somebody had folded her inward for years. So, I made the decision I hated. "We'll stay tonight," I said. "But I'm staying too." Dennis laughed once. "You're not sleeping in my house. My mother's name is on the deed," I said. "And I'm not asking." He stared at me for a few seconds, probably weighing whether he could push me again. He chose not to. Smartest thing he did all night. I made Mom sit at the kitchen table while I cleaned the small cut on her lip. She kept apologizing for the mess. That's how I knew it was bad. A woman who has just been hurt should not be worried about broken ceramic. Dennis hovered in the living room, muttering under his breath and pretending to search for the remote. I found the first aid kit under the sink beside dishwasher pods and a bottle of Windex. My mother flinched when I touched the cotton pad to her mouth. "Sorry," I said. "It's all right, honey. It wasn't." I wanted to ask everything at once. How long? How often did he hit you? Did he threaten you? Did anyone else know? But interrogation and care are not the same thing. So I asked only one question. "Do you feel safe sleeping here tonight if I'm in the house?" Her eyes moved toward the living room, then back to me. Yes, she said. Dennis shouted. I can hear you two whispering. I raised my voice just enough. Good, my mother almost smiled. Almost. I slept in the guest room, though sleep is too generous a word. I sat on top of the quilt with my boots on and the lamp off, listening to the house settle. Every home has a sound at night. That house used to have peaceful sounds. The ice maker clicking. Mom's old wall clock ticking too loud in the hallway. The neighbor's dog barking at nothing. That night, I heard Dennis pacing. At 1:18 a.m., he stopped outside the guest room door. I knew because the floorboard creaked. I didn't move. He stood there maybe 10 seconds. Then he walked away. That told me plenty. The next morning, he came into the kitchen, acting like a wounded king. He had changed into khaki shorts and a Duke sweatshirt, like Sunday morning clothes could erase Saturday night behavior. His hair was wet from a shower. He smelled like mint mouthwash and resentment. My shoulder hurts, he announced. I was making coffee in my mother's old Mr. Coffee machine. That's strange, I said. I thought I was just a government secretary. My mother looked down at her toast to hide a smile. Dennis didn't find it funny. You assaulted me. You grabbed my wrist. I was trying to get you out of my home. My mother asked me to stay. He leaned over the counter toward her. Elaine, tell her she misunderstood. That was the moment I saw the whole machinery of him. Not just anger, not just drinking. A system. Push, deny, make her doubt herself. Make everyone else doubt her, too. My mother's hand tightened around her coffee cup. I stepped between them before he got too close. Back up, Dennis's face flushed. You don't give orders here. No, I said. I give warnings. He stared at me, then grabbed his truck keys from the bowl by the door. I'm going to breakfast, he snapped. Maybe when I come back, both of you will be done with your little performance. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the window over the sink. For a full minute, my mother didn't move. Then she started crying without making a sound. That broke something in me. Not the kind of breaking where you fall apart, the kind where a door inside you closes and locks. I sat beside her. Mom, I said, has this happened before? She wiped her face with a napkin and nodded once. How many times? I don't know anymore. I had to look away for a second. At the refrigerator magnets, at the church calendar, at the photograph of me in uniform that Dennis had moved behind a stack of grocery coupons. When did it start? After he retired? Maybe before? I made excuses. What kind? She gave a tired little laugh. The usual kind. Stress, money, bourbon, me being difficult. I hated how practiced those words sounded. Then she told me about the checking account, how Dennis had started helping with bills, how he took her debit card because she was too trusting, how he read her texts, how he told neighbors she was getting forgetful. He says if I leave, he'll prove I can't manage alone, she whispered. There it was, not one bad night. A cage. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. I need to document this. She stiffened. No police. Not yet. I'm not going to force you, but we need proof. Messages, bank records, photos, anything you're willing to save. She stared at the coffee cup like the answer might be in there. I don't want cameras in my bedroom. Never, I said. Only shared spaces, and only if you say yes. She looked up at me. You'd do that legally. I'll call an attorney first. That seemed to calm her a little. By noon, we had changed her phone password, photographed the bruising without making it graphic or humiliating, and written down every incident she could remember, dates if she knew them, holidays if she didn't, after Thanksgiving, the week before Easter, the night the water heater broke. Real life does not always come with clean timelines. At 2:07 p.m., Dennis came back with Bojangles biscuits and the attitude of a man expecting the world to reset itself. It did not. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook in front of her. I was beside her. Dennis froze. What's this? My mother's voice shook, but she got the words out. I'm writing things down. Dennis looked at me with pure hatred. And I knew then he would not stop. Not because he loved her, because control was the only thing he had left. Dennis stopped pretending after that. Not completely. Men like him never do. They saved their best performances for church parking lots and backyard cookouts. But inside the house, something changed. Once he realized my mother had started writing things down, he got quieter, and somehow that was worse. 3 days after I moved into the guest room, I woke up around 5:00 the morning to the sound of kitchen drawers opening and closing, not slamming. Careful. I stayed still for a second and checked my phone. Rain had finally stopped overnight. The digital clock beside the bed glowed 5:11 a.m. Another drawer opened downstairs, then silence. I slipped out of bed quietly and walked halfway down the hallway before I saw light under the kitchen doorway. Dennis stood at the counter in his underwear and Duke's sweatshirt holding one of my mother's checkbooks. He didn't hear me at first. He was flipping pages fast, looking for something. When he finally noticed me, he jerked slightly and shoved the checkbook closed. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked. He stared at me for a second too long, looking for stamps. At 5:00 the morning, he shrugged. Couldn't remember where Elaine moved things. I nodded like I believed him. That irritated him more than an argument would have. The next week turned into a strange kind of Cold War. Dennis behaved himself physically. No yelling, no grabbing, no bruises. But once you know how to spot control, you can't unsee it. The way he interrupted my mother every time she spoke. The way he hovered when she checked her phone. The way she asked permission before spending $20 at Target. I started noticing smaller things too. Her name missing from one utility account. Late payment notices hidden in a kitchen drawer. A pink envelope from Wells Fargo shoved beneath old recipes. And always Dennis watching. One afternoon, while he was out golfing with his buddies and Carrie Mom finally opened up more, we sat at the dining room table going through old paperwork while a ceiling fan clicked overhead like it was counting down to something. "I should have paid more attention," she murmured. "This isn't your fault." "Yes, it is." "No," I said firmly. "It isn't," she rubbed her forehead. "You know what the worst part is? It wasn't even the yelling." I looked up from the bank statement in my hand. It was how gradual it happened, one thing at a time, like water rising. That stayed with me because she was right. Nobody wakes up one morning and volunteers to become controlled by another person. It happens slowly, a favor here, a criticism there, a little embarrassment, a little fear, until one day they don't recognize themselves anymore. I spread several papers across the table, checking account withdrawals, credit card advances, home equity paperwork. Then I found something that made my stomach tighten. "Mom," I said carefully, "did you refinance the lake cabin?" She blinked. Number. I turned the paper toward her. There it was, a transfer form connected to the cabin near Lake Gaston that my father bought back in 1987. The place where I learned to fish. The place Mom still kept Dad's old thermos in the same kitchen cabinet 30 years later. Dennis's name appeared on part of the document, and my mother's signature sat near the bottom. Only, it didn't look right. Elaine stared at it for several seconds. "I never signed this." "You sure?" "Yes." I watched her face carefully. She wasn't confused. She was scared. Big difference. "Mom," I asked quietly, "did Dennis ever bring papers for you to sign without explaining them?" A humorless laugh escaped her all the time. That afternoon, I made 3 phone calls from the back porch. The first was to an elder law attorney in Wilmington named Susan Delgado, former prosecutor, sharp voice, no patience for excuses. The second was to an old Army friend named Nate Hollis, who now worked in financial compliance for a regional bank in Charlotte. The third call took the longest. Adult Protective Services. I sat there listening to cicadas scream in the pine trees while explaining my mother's situation to a calm woman named Patrice. She asked practical questions. Did Elaine seem mentally competent? Yes. Was there physical violence? Yes. Financial control? Absolutely. Did Elaine want help? Long pause. Yes. I finally answered. I think she does. That night, Dennis grilled hamburgers like we were one big happy family. You ever notice how some people think normal routines erase ugly behavior? He stood on the deck, flipping burgers and white New Balance sneakers, while country music played softly from a portable speaker. If somebody drove by, they'd think it was just another retired couple enjoying a North Carolina evening. Meanwhile, my mother jumped every time Dennis raised his voice toward the dog. I watched him through the sliding glass door, studied him. That's another thing people misunderstand about military intelligence work. Most of it is not action, it's observation, patterns, patience. Dennis wasn't smart in the traditional sense, but he understood intimidation. He knew exactly how far to push without leaving obvious evidence. At dinner, he smiled at me across the table. "You still staying a while for now?" "That can't be healthy," he said. "A woman your age living with her mother again." My mother immediately looked nervous, waiting for conflict. I took a bite of hamburger first, chewed, swallowed, then smiled slightly. "You'd be amazed what women can survive, Dennis." His jaw tightened. Score one for me. Later that evening, after Dennis fell asleep in front of television, Mom handed me an old manila folder from the hall closet. "I forgot about these," she whispered. Inside were unpaid tax notices, gambling withdrawal slips from Cherokee casinos, and 2 handwritten "I owe us." One amount was for $18,000, another for 12. My chest tightened. "How long has he been gambling?" "A few years, maybe. You said he liked poker. You didn't say he had debts." She looked ashamed again. I kept thinking if I could just help him get caught up, he'd calm down. That sentence nearly broke my heart. Because that's what good people do. They try to love others back into decency. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it feeds monsters. Around midnight, after Mom went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the forged cabin paperwork. The old me, the younger Army version, wanted to corner Dennis immediately, push him hard, make him crack. But Susan Delgado's voice echoed in my head. "If he feels trapped too early, he'll destroy records and turn your mother into the unstable villain." So I waited, and I hated every second of it. Then my phone buzzed. Text from Nate Hollis. "Call me as soon as possible. Found something bad." I stepped outside onto the dark back porch and called him immediately. Nate didn't waste time. "Rachel," he said quietly. "Your stepfather's name showed up connected to 2 elder fraud complaints in Wake County." I felt my pulse slow. That cold feeling again. "What kind of complaints? Home repair scams? Loan manipulation?" "Mostly widows." I looked back through the kitchen window. Dennis snored softly in the recliner, while my mother's house wrapped itself around him like he owned every inch of it. Maybe he thought this was still a family argument. It wasn't anymore. A week later, Dennis invited the whole family over for Sunday dinner like nothing had happened. That was his style. If things got too tense behind closed doors, he'd drag everything back into public where he could play the charming husband again. He needed an audience the same way some people need oxygen. The dinner happened at my cousin Laura's place in Cary. Big brick house in one of those newer developments where every mailbox looks identical and every backyard has a gas grill worth more than the first car I owned. I almost didn't go. Honestly, I was exhausted. Not physically, mentally. People think investigations are exciting. Most of the time, they're paperwork waiting and trying not to lose your temper while somebody dangerous keeps smiling at everyone around you. But my mother wanted to go. "I don't want people asking questions," she said quietly while getting ready. That sentence bothered me more than she realized, because it meant she'd spent years organizing her life around avoiding embarrassment instead of avoiding harm. So, we went. Dennis arrived carrying a peach cobbler like he was running for mayor. "Look at this crowd," he announced loudly. "A family that still eats together. That's rare these days." Everybody laughed politely. I stood near the kitchen island nursing a Diet Coke and watched him work the room. He kissed my mother's cheek in front of people, pulled out chairs for her, touched her lower back constantly. Performance. Every bit of it. My cousin Laura leaned toward me while arranging deviled eggs on a tray. "You and Dennis doing better?" I kept my face neutral. We're managing. That's another thing you learn after enough years around tense situations. Most people don't actually want the truth. They want reassurance. Dennis wandered over a few minutes later wearing khakis and a UNC polo shirt tucked in too tight. "There she is," he said, pointing at me with barbecue tongs. "Our mysterious government employee." "Retired government employee," I corrected. "Same thing," he chuckled. "Rachel still won't tell us what she actually did all those years. Mostly paperwork," he smirked. "That's what I keep telling everybody." A few people laughed. I smiled politely and took a sip of soda. Inside, I could feel my jaw tightening, not because of the joke, because my mother laughed too, not genuinely, nervously, like she was trying to keep weather from turning bad. Dinner moved outside onto the patio, kids running around with sparklers left over from 4th of July. Somebody's Bluetooth speaker playing old Tim McGrath songs too quietly. The smell of grilled chicken and citronella candles hanging in humid evening air. Normal American family stuff, which somehow made the whole thing sadder. Dennis sat at the head of the patio table holding court like always. He launched into one story after another. Golf complaints, gas prices, young people being lazy, the usual retired man starter pack. Then he started steering the conversation toward me, subtle at first. "You know, Rachel's had a hard time adjusting since retirement. I kept eating my potato salad. She spent too many years around stressful environments," he continued. "Change is a person." Laura glanced at me awkwardly. Dennis kept going. "Military life isn't exactly normal. Some folks come home carrying things." There it was. Planting seeds, making me sound unstable before anything became public. Classic control tactic. My Uncle Randy cleared his throat. "Well, she seems all right to me." Dennis lifted one shoulder. "Oh, sure. Rachel's tough. Sometimes, maybe too tough." My mother went completely still beside me. That tiny reaction told me she understood exactly what he was doing. I finally looked up. "Dennis." "Yeah, you should probably stop talking now." His smile tightened slightly. "See that intensity I was talking about?" A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Nobody wants conflict at a family dinner, especially older families. They'll tolerate years of tension just to avoid one ugly evening. Dennis leaned back in his chair like he was completely relaxed. "I'm just saying combat environments affect people." I set my fork down carefully. I was Army intelligence. Same difference. Number. Not the same difference. But arguing details wasn't the point. The point was power. Dennis wanted everybody at that table quietly wondering if maybe I was overreacting, maybe emotional, maybe damaged. I'd seen the strategy before. Hell, I'd briefed commanders on manipulation tactics overseas that looked cleaner than this. After dinner, I walked into the garage to grab another case of bottled water from the extra refrigerator. Dennis followed me. Of course, he did. The garage smelled like motor oil and old lawn equipment. One fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Dennis closed the door behind him halfway. "You enjoying yourself?" he asked. "I'm fine, you know," he said softly. "People start asking questions when middle-aged women move back in with their mothers." I grabbed the water case. "You done?" "Nope," he stepped closer. "I built that life with Elaine. You think you can walk in after all these years and tear it apart?" I looked at him evenly. "You tore it apart yourself." His face hardened instantly. "There's not a person in this family who's going to believe your little stories over me." I didn't answer. That bothered him more. "She needs me," he continued. "You think your mother can handle bills, lawyers, courtrooms? She'll fall apart in a month." That one almost got me. Not because it scared me, because part of me worried he might believe it. Abusive people spend years convincing victims they can't survive alone. Eventually, even outsiders start doubting it. Dennis lowered his voice further. "You should have stayed gone, Rachel." I stepped closer too. Not aggressive, just enough to make him look up slightly, instead of down. "You really ought to stop talking when you think you're winning." For a second, something flickered across his face. Uncertainty. Then footsteps approached from inside the house, and he backed away fast, putting his fake smile back on before Laura opened the garage door. "There you two are," she said nervously. Dennis grabbed a water bottle immediately. Just helping out, of course. Always helping. Later that evening, while people ate cobbler on the patio, an older man named Carl Whitaker pulled me aside near the fence. Carl was one of Dennis's poker buddies, retired electrician, quiet guy with nicotine-stained fingers and tired eyes. "You got a minute?" he asked. I nodded cautiously. We stepped away from the others. Carl kept his voice low. "Dennis been talking about investment stuff around your mama." Every nerve in my body sharpened. "What kind of investment stuff?" Carl stared out toward the trees. "My sister got mixed up with him last year." I waited. He told her about some property repair business. Said retirees could make passive income flipping old homes. And Carl swallowed hard. She lost almost 40 grand. There it was, another piece sliding into place. Did she file a complaint? Didn't want to admit she got conned. Would she talk now? Carl looked toward Dennis, who was loudly explaining cryptocurrency to my uncle while repeatedly calling Bitcoin Bitcoin. Then Carl looked back at me. "If it keeps him from hurting somebody else, yeah, I think she would." I nodded slowly. "Thank you." Carl rubbed the back of his neck. "I always figured something wasn't right with him." I glanced across the patio at Dennis, laughing too loud under the string lights. "Yeah," I said quietly. "So did I." That night, driving back to Raleigh with my mother asleep in the passenger seat, I realized something important. Dennis thought this was still a private family problem. He had no idea the walls were already closing in around him. Dennis hosted poker night every other Friday. Same group, same routine, cheap beer in the garage refrigerator, folding card table in the den, cigars smoked halfway out on the back deck while they complained about taxes, football, and how nobody wants to work anymore. For years, my mother treated those Fridays like incoming bad weather. She'd clean the house top to bottom, make chili or pulled pork sandwiches, then disappear upstairs, while Dennis played King of the Hill downstairs with his friends. The Friday, everything collapsed, started quietly, too quietly. Around 4 that afternoon, I helped Mom load 2 overnight bags into my truck while Dennis was out getting ice and beer. She kept looking over her shoulder like she expected him to come flying down the driveway any second. "You all right?" I asked. She nodded too fast. "No, really." She took a shaky breath. "I keep feeling guilty." I leaned against the tailgate for a second. "For leaving?" "Yes. That's normal. I should have done this years ago." I looked at her carefully. "You sent the text, Mom. That matters." Her eyes watered immediately. Not dramatic crying, just exhaustion finally leaking out after years of holding everything inside. "I was so embarrassed," she whispered. "You don't need to be. I stayed too long." A breeze moved through the pine trees behind the house. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower buzzed faintly. Ordinary sounds. That was the strange part about the whole thing. Life keeps sounding normal, even while somebody's world is coming apart. I closed the truck bed gently. "Tonight isn't about revenge," I told her. She looked unconvinced. "Yes, it is," she said softly. I thought about arguing. Didn't, because honestly part of me wanted revenge too. Not movie revenge. Not violence. I wanted Dennis exposed. I wanted him sitting in a room where his charm stopped working. I wanted other people to finally see what my mother had been surviving. We drove her to a friend's condo near Garner around 6:30. Elaine carried only 2 bags and her medications. 40 years of adult life reduced to overnight luggage. That stayed with me. By the time I returned to the house, poker night had already started. I parked half a block away and sat in my truck for a minute, watching warm yellow light spill through the living room curtains. Laughter drifted faintly through the humid air. Dennis's laugh carried the loudest. Of course it did. Inside the house, nothing looked unusual at first glance. Carl Whitaker sat at the card table, nursing a Bud Light. 2 former dealership buddies argued over college basketball rankings. Somebody had tracked cigar ash onto Mom's clean carpet already. Dennis stood near the kitchen island pouring bourbon like he owned the planet. He looked up when I walked in. Well, he announced, grinning broadly. Looks like Princess Soldier came to supervise. A couple men chuckled awkwardly. Carl didn't. I shut the door behind me calmly. Mom's staying with Sharon tonight. Dennis blinked once, then recovered fast. Good for her. But I saw it. That tiny flash of panic. Control slipping again. One of the men at the table frowned. Everything all right with Elaine? Dennis waved dismissively. She gets emotional sometimes. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. No, I said evenly. She gets afraid sometimes. The room quieted slightly. Dennis forced a laugh. Oh, Jesus. Are we doing this now? Carl stared down at his cards. Dennis poured himself another drink. You know what Rachel's problem is? He said to the room. Too much government work. Starts thinking everybody's guilty of something. Nobody answered. Interesting. The mood had shifted already. Dennis noticed too, so he pushed harder. She actually thinks I control Elaine. He snorted. Hell, Elaine signs whatever I put in front of her. There it was. Carl slowly looked up. Dennis kept talking drunk enough not to hear himself anymore. You spend enough years married, you learn how to manage people. One of the dealership guys shifted uncomfortably. Dennis, what? He snapped. I'm joking. No, he wasn't. That was the thing about men like him. Eventually, arrogance makes them careless. I leaned back slightly in my chair. What about the cabin? His eyes snapped toward me immediately. What cabin? The Lake Gaston property. Dennis took a long sip of bourbon. You mean Elaine's cabin? I held his gaze. No, I mean my father's cabin. Silence. Real silence this time. Even the television noise from the other room suddenly sounded too loud. Dennis shrugged. Property taxes are expensive. Carl finally spoke. You told me your wife inherited that place. Dennis looked irritated now. She did. No, I said calmly. She didn't. His jaw tightened. You accusing me of something? Before I could answer, headlights swept across the front windows. Dennis glanced toward the driveway. Then another set of headlights appeared, and another. The front room went completely still. A knock sounded at the door. Firm, professional. Dennis looked at me slowly. What the hell did you do? I stood up. Not me. Second knock. Wake County Sheriff's Office. One of the poker players muttered. Jesus Christ. Dennis moved toward the front door fast. I stepped sideways into his path. Not threatening. Just there. His face reened instantly. You set me up. No, Dennis, I said quietly. You did that yourself. The knocking came again. Mr. Hellbrook, we need to speak with you. Dennis looked around the room desperately now at his friends, at Carl, at me, trying to figure out where control had gone. Carl stood slowly from the poker table. My sister filed her statement yesterday, he said. Dennis stared at him in disbelief. You son of a Carl didn't flinch. You stole from a widow, Dennis. One of the dealership men pushed his chair back immediately. Dennis, what the hell is going on? Dennis pointed at me wildly. She's lying. All of this is her. She's been trying to turn Elaine against me. I walked to the door and opened it. Two sheriff's deputies stood outside beside a woman from Adult Protective Services, holding a folder thick with paperwork. Rain had started again lightly behind them. One deputy glanced past me into the house, then looked back at me more carefully. Recognition hit his face slowly. Ma'am, he said cautiously. Lieutenant Colonel Mercer. I nodded once. Dennis froze. Actually froze. The deputy straightened slightly without even thinking about it. I didn't realize you were involved. Dennis looked between us confused and suddenly uncertain. That was the moment everything changed. Not because of rank, not because of intimidation, because for the first time, Dennis understood he had completely misjudged me. All those years he thought silence meant weakness, that keeping calm meant submission. The deputy turned back toward him. Mr. Halbrook, we need to ask you some questions regarding financial exploitation complaints and threats reported by Mrs. Halbrook. Dennis laughed nervously. This is insane. Nobody joined him. Carl looked disgusted. One of the dealership guys quietly grabbed his car keys. The other wouldn't even meet Dennis's eyes anymore. The whole little kingdom was collapsing in real time. Dennis suddenly looked at me again, almost pleading now. Rachel, come on. We're family. I stared at him for a long moment, then said the truest thing I'd said all night. No, Dennis. We were just trapped in the same house. Outside across the yard near my truck, my mother stood under an umbrella beside Sharon. Dennis saw her instantly. Elaine. She didn't move. He stepped toward the porch, but the deputy stopped him gently. My mother pulled off her wedding ring slowly. Not dramatic, not angry, just tired. I'm done being afraid in my own kitchen, she said. Dennis opened his mouth. Nothing came out. And honestly, that silence was more satisfying than any revenge fantasy I'd ever imagined. People think the hard part ends once somebody leaves. It doesn't. That's just the moment reality finally starts. 4 months after poker night, my mother moved into a small townhouse outside Wilmington. Nothing fancy. Beige siding, tiny front porch, wind chimes hanging beside the door that rattled every time coastal air rolled through. But it was quiet that mattered. The first time I visited after the move, I noticed something immediately. She slept through the night. No television running at 2. 0 inches the morning. No footsteps pacing the hallway. No listening for truck doors slamming outside. Just sleep. I don't think people understand how much fear changes a body until they watch somebody slowly come out of it. Mom started doing small things again. Real things. She joined a watercolor class at the senior center twice a week, started buying flowers for the porch, began drinking coffee in the mornings without rushing through it like she expected criticism with every sip. One afternoon, I found her sitting outside reading an old paperback mystery novel with her feet propped on a stool, and it hit me that I hadn't seen her relaxed in years. Not truly relaxed. The legal mess with Dennis dragged on, though. That part wasn't satisfying. There were hearings, statements, bank reviews, endless paperwork, lawyers charging by the hour to explain things we already knew. Turns out, real justice moves slower than people think. Dennis was eventually charged with financial exploitation fraud connected to forged property paperwork and intimidation tied to witness statements. Carl's sister testified. So did 2 other women nobody knew about before the investigation started. Apparently, my mother had not been his first practice run. That knowledge made me physically sick for a while. Not because it surprised me, because predators almost never start with their worst victim. The cabin near Lake Gaston stayed in our family after the forged transfer was blocked. Mom cried when Susan Delgado called with the news. Not dramatic crying, just quiet relief. My father bought that place after 20 years working at a textile plant. Every loose board and crooked cabinet in that cabin carried his fingerprints somewhere. Losing it would have destroyed her. One Saturday in October, Mom and I drove up there together for the first time since everything happened. North Carolina autumn had finally settled in. The trees around the lake had turned gold and rust-cold, and the air smelled like damp wood and chimney smoke. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. Funny how childhood changes dimensions in your head. Mom unlocked the door slowly. Inside still smelled faintly like coffee grounds, old pine, and the tackle box my father used to keep under the sink. For a minute, neither of us said anything. Then Mom laughed softly. What? She pointed toward the refrigerator. Your father still has mustard in there from 2019. I laughed harder than the joke deserved. Maybe because we both needed it. We spent the afternoon cleaning the place up, opened windows, swept leaves off the deck, found old photo albums in a plastic storage bin. At one point, Mom sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs and stared out toward the lake. You know something strange, she said. What? I thought leaving Dennis would feel dramatic. I leaned against the counter, but it didn't. She shook her head. It felt quiet. That made sense to me. Most life-changing moments are quieter than television teaches us. No music swelling, no speeches, just somebody finally getting tired enough to choose themselves. Later that evening, we sat on the dock wrapped in old blankets while the sun went down over the water. Mom looked healthier than she had in years. Still older, still tired sometimes. Trauma doesn't evaporate because somebody leaves a bad situation, but she looked present again like herself. I need to tell you something, she said. I glanced over. When you were little after your father died, I always worried you became too serious, too fast. I smiled faintly. I was kind of a weird kid. You were careful, she corrected softly. Always listening, always watching moods. I stared out across the lake. She wasn't wrong. Military training sharpened instincts I already had. It didn't create them. Mom folded the blanket tighter around her shoulders. I thought keeping peace in the house was protecting you. I swallowed once before answering. I know. No, she said quietly. I don't think you do. That surprised me enough. I looked over. Tears filled her eyes, but she kept talking anyway. I should have left sooner. I should have stopped making excuses for him. I should have believed what it was doing to both of us. For a second, she looked older than I'd ever seen her. Not weak, just honest. I moved closer and put an arm around her shoulders. Mom, I said carefully. The bravest thing you did wasn't leaving. She looked at me. It was sending the code. That broke her composure completely. She cried into my shoulder, while the lake water knocked softly against the dock beneath us. And honestly, that moment mattered more to me than Dennis getting arrested. More than the investigation, more than watching him lose control in front of his friends, because revenge alone doesn't heal much. Freedom does. A few weeks later, I drove back to Fayetteville, with the windows cracked and old classic rock playing quietly through the truck speakers. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace. Not victory, not triumph, just peace. And at my age, I've learned that's worth more. Dennis thought kindness was weakness. By the time he finally understood the difference, my mother was already gone, and the little world he controlled was falling apart around him. If you've ever worried about someone you love staying quiet longer than they should trust your instincts, sometimes people don't need somebody to rescue them. They just need somebody willing to stand beside them when they finally decide to.